Thunder piled over the Caldwell house while a phone buzzed on the counter, and the narrator said, "Tonight, the lie stops pretending." Emma said, "Play it," already pressing speaker as rain rattled the windows. A nurse said, "The records confirm a neonatal transfer in 1996. Nathan said, "Turn that off," and his voice scraped like a hinge. Laura said, "This is a misunderstanding," and her hand hovered above the truth. The narrator said, "In the pause after denial, fear blooms like mold." Emma said, "Why does my bracelet number not match the hospital file?" Nathan said, "Because I protected you." And the word fell like a brick. Laura said, "We signed a paper to keep you safe," and the kitchen seemed to shrink. The narrator said, "A secret is a debt with interest. And tonight the bill arrives." Emma said, "Who am I if not yours?" And thunder answered like distant drums. Nathan said, "You are ours," but even the light over the sink flickered at the lie. The narrator said, "Names are anchors, and tonight every anchor drags across a broken seabed." The narrator said silence clung to the kitchen until Emma spoke and the air cracked like thin ice. Emma said, "If you loved me, you would have told me," and her palm flattened against the cold counter. Nathan said, "I chose the lie that kept us standing," while his eyes traced exits like a trapped animal. Laura said, "We were told you would be taken," and panic hissed at the edge of her words. The narrator said, "Love furnished this room, but fear paid its bills." Emma said, "Who signed and who was paid," and rain hammered the roof like a drumline. Nathan said, "There was a benefactor," and the syllables clung to his teeth. Laura said, "We were desperate," and she opened a drawer as if mercy lived beside the cutlery. The narrator said, "Drawers do not store absolution, only receipts." Emma said, "Give me the truth now," and the room held its breath. Nathan said, "If I speak it aloud, it becomes real," and his shoulders sagged. Laura said, "The envelope is in the pantry," and the word pantry sounded like a confession. The narrator said, Emma stepped into the pantry and reached for a biscuit tin that rattled like a nervous tooth. Emma said this tin was for birthday candles, and her breath snagged as the lid loosened. Laura said, "Please be gentle, but paper never forgives the hands that wake it." The narrator said, inside waited a cashier's check stub and a letter with a lawyer's crest. Emma said Julian Price, and the name felt like a key that opened a wrong room. Nathan said, "He arranged everything," and his hands hung at his sides like scolded children. Emma said, "Hush money to keep a baby," and the light over the stove hummed like a witness. The narrator said, "Numbers are ruthless, yet they ruin the living softly." Laura said, "They promised we would be safe," and her voice thinned to thread. Emma said, "Safety is not love," and the tin clicked shut like a verdict. The narrator said, "Every page births a question, and tonight the house is all questions." Nathan said, "I will call him," and fear ghosted across his face. The narrator said, Daniel arrived soaked and alert, dragged in by a single message and the scent of trouble. Daniel said, "I am here," and his steadiness cut the storm's noise. Emma said, "They hid my life from me," and she hugged the tin to her chest like something that could bite. Nathan said, "We saved you," and the claim echoed across the tile like an empty shout. Laura said, "Please do not hate us," and hope frayed between her fingers. The narrator said, "A house can shelter bodies, not secrets." Daniel said, "We start with process, chain of custody, and a DNA test," and the words put rails under the moment. Emma said, "Truth first, then mercy," and her eyes challenged the thunder. Nathan said, "We should wait," but waiting had already done the harm. The narrator said, "Time is a locksmith turning every key tonight." Daniel said, "Call the lawyer and record the call," and he tapped speaker. Emma said, "Julian Price will explain," and thunder rolled like a warning. The narrator said, "The first ring always lasts the longest when truth waits on the line." The narrator said, "The call connected with a click that lifted like a latch on a locked room." Julian said, "I advised your parents under duress," and breath fogged the tiny speaker. Emma said, whose child am I? And the question landed in the kitchen like heavy boots. Nathan said, say nothing more, and fear bled through the frame of his voice. Laura said, she deserves to know, and her shoulders set down a stone. The narrator said, every sentence tonight has its own gravity. Julian said, there was a threat against an infant at St. Augustine, and paper rustled near the mic. Emma said, was I stolen or saved? And thunder crept along the roof. Julian said, you were moved to protect two families, and the room forgot to breathe. The narrator said, mercy can leave a scar that never closes. Julian said, a woman named Maya Hart is entangled in this history, and the name hung like smoke. Emma said, then tomorrow I will find her, and the storm ran out of breath against the glass. Dawn scraped pale light over the Caldwell house as the narrator said, morning makes liars hope for mercy. Emma said, we test today, and her voice found a steadier edge. Daniel said, I booked the lab, and his clipboard knocked once against the doorframe. Nathan said, breakfast first, but the toast cooled untouched. Laura said, I will come with you, and her fingers fussed a napkin into a white flag. The narrator said, rituals pretend to be anchors when the shore is gone. Emma said, Julian's file names Maya Hart, and the syllables turned like keys in a rusted lock. Daniel said, chain of custody matters, and he set vials on the table like glass truth. Nathan said, no cameras, and he unplugged the smart display. Laura said, we kept you safe, and the room heard the past tense. The narrator said, love begs for a verdict and fears the sentence. Emma said, after the test I call Maya, and the day finally seemed to start. Rain returned as the narrator said, hospitals smell like bleach and unfinished stories. Emma said, we do this clean, and she signed the consent with a steady hand. Daniel said, timestamps synchronized, and he photographed the forms. Nathan said, how long will it take? And hope wobbled on the last word. Laura said, hours for the rapid panel, and she carried a plastic bag like it held breath. The narrator said, paperwork builds fences around pain. A nurse said swab and draw, and the kit clicked open. Emma said, no more secrets, while the cotton brushed her cheek. Daniel said, samples sealed, and the cap snapped with tidy finality. The narrator said, truth does not rush, but it moves. Nathan said, if the result breaks us, and his voice thinned. Emma said, then we break into the shape that fits the truth. Waiting chewed the hours as the narrator said, time fattens on uncertainty. Emma said, Maya might refuse me, and she scrolled a decade of strangers with that name. Daniel said, we build context before contact, and he mapped addresses on a pad. Nathan said, I remember a wing named Hart, and the memory dragged its feet. Laura said, the benefactor signed as J. Price, and guilt flickered like a short fuse. The narrator said, clues are kindling that fear keeps wet. Emma said, Maya Hart, neonatal volunteer, St. Augustine 1996, and her breath hitched. Daniel said, public records confirm a residency later, and he circled a city line. Nathan said, if she knows the other family, and the word other stung. Laura said, what if meeting her ruins them too, and the worry shrank her shoulders. The narrator said, mercy can be a door or a wall. Emma said, I will knock anyway. The rapid result posted, and the narrator said, numbers arrive like weather. Emma said, non-parental index high, and the word high burned like frost. Nathan said, I loved you before math, and his eyes begged the screen for mercy. Laura said, I am still your mother, and the syllables clung hard to breath. Daniel said, this indicates a transfer at birth, and he set the printout down level. The narrator said, truth does not apologize, it simply stands. Emma said, then my birth mother lives somewhere with a story that includes me, and the room tipped. Nathan said, I feared this day, and his shoulders folded. Laura said, I feared you would hate me, and tears mapped the old roads of her face. Daniel said, next step is Maya, and the plan steadied the air. The narrator said, grief and clarity can share a chair. Emma said, "Call her now." The call rang into a quiet clinic as the narrator said, "Names travel faster than explanations." A receptionist said Dr. Hart is with a patient, and hold music thinned minutes. Emma said, "Tell her Emma Caldwell needs to speak about St. Augustine 1996. And silence sharpened. Daniel said, "Breathe on fours." And his count steadied the room. Nathan said, "If she refuses," and dread floated like dust. Laura said, "She will answer," and faith stitched itself from scraps. The narrator said, "Hope is a small but insistent drummer." A new voice said, "This is Dr. Maya Hart," and the temperature changed. Emma said, "I believe my life intersects yours," and the line exhaled. Maya said, "Then come tomorrow at 10, and the hour drew itself like a horizon. The narrator said, "Journeys begin when doors open from the other side." Morning pressed thin light on the clinic as the narrator said, "Truth waits in rooms that smell like coffee and caution." Maya said, "Emma, I kept records when others looked away," and her gaze weighed the years. Emma said, "I need the whole of it," and the clock ticked too loud. Daniel said, "We document everything," and he set a small recorder down. Nathan said, "If this harms her, we walk," and the chair creaked beneath his warning. Laura said, "Please speak gently," and hope curled around her fingers. Maya said, "A donor funded a transfer under security protocols," and the word donor chilled the air. The narrator said, "Names carry weather, and today storms travel on paper." Emma said, "Was the donor Julian Price?" and the room tilted. Maya said, "He paid the hospital, not me," and something old in her voice broke. The narrator said, Maya opened a file, and the room braced like a ship crossing shoal water. Maya said, "2 infants flagged in a threat assessment after a break-in," and paper hissed. Emma said, "Who targeted them?" and her breath shortened. Daniel said, "Chain shows a midnight reroute," and his pen underlined a date. Nathan said, "This is madness," and the fluorescent hum sounded hostile. Laura said, "Were we chosen or convenient?" and her voice thinned. Maya said, "A second family accepted a sealed arrangement," and the seal still felt warm. The narrator said, "Fear breeds silence and calls it care." Emma said, "Do you know their name?" and hope bruised the question. Maya said, "Only an initial and a wing code," and she closed the file like a wound. They crossed to St. Augustine archives, while the narrator said, "Old buildings hoard stories like coins." Emma said, "We ask for Wing C logs," and her voice would not bow. Daniel said, "Public access under patient rights," and he slid a request across the desk. An administrator said, "Those records are restricted," and his smile did not reach his eyes. Nathan said, "We have counsel," and the name Julian hung like rust. Laura said, "Please help us," and shame flushed her cheeks. A man said, "Leave this alone," and Oliver Crane stepped from a corridor with a badge and a grin. The narrator said, "Every road to truth grows a toll booth." Emma said, "Who are you to decide my life?" and the desk calendar shook. Oliver said, "I collect debts you do not see," and the corridor swallowed the light. The narrator said, "Threats grow teeth when spoken in hallways." Emma said, "You cannot scare me out of myself," and the words steadied her feet. Oliver said, "Walk away and keep your pretty life," and his tone polished the menace. Daniel said, "Step back now," and his stance drew a clear line. Nathan said, "Who pays you?" and the question scuffed the floor. Laura said, "We are asking for simple records," and her plea fluttered. Oliver said, "Simple things cut deepest," and he drifted off with a nod to security. The narrator said, "Power loves corridors with cameras that never blink." Emma said, "We file a formal demand," and resolve rose like heat. Daniel said, "I will serve notice by end of day," and certainty put steel in the air. Night returned them home as the narrator said, "Every battle sends splinters into the quiet." Emma said, "He knows more than a fixer," and the name Oliver soured the room. Daniel said, "I traced the wing code to a donor ledger," and he laid a photocopy down. Nathan said Julian again, and fatigue dragged the syllables. Laura said, "Did he buy our silence or our hope?" And her hands shook. Emma said, "The second family is marked, Heart Wing B, initial M, and the letter burned." Daniel said, "We can subpoena backups and camera logs," and the plan breathed. The narrator said, "Rising conflict is a staircase you climb with cut feet." Emma said, "Tomorrow we meet Maya again with lawyers," and thunder muttered far off. Nathan said, "Whatever comes we stand," and the house tried to believe him. The narrator said, "Storms return when papers open." Maya said, "I requested the sealed addendum," and her hands stayed steady. Emma said, "Say it plain," and the clock refused to tick. Daniel said, "Recorder on," and the red light held vigil. Nathan said, "We can still stop," but the door clicked, locked behind them. Laura said, "Please," and hope thinned. Maya said, "The second infant survived a threat, then was reassigned under Wing B to a mother with clearance." The narrator said, "Truth unspools like wire," and the room listened. Emma said, "Was that mother you?" and the syllables cut. Maya said, "Yes," and the word fell hard. Nathan said, "Who signed the reassignment?" and guilt climbed the walls. Daniel said, "Julian's name appears twice," and paper rasped. Laura said, "There's another child," and silence broke like glass. The narrator said, Maya set a small shoebox on the table like a heart that never learned to quiet. Maya said, "Inside are copies I kept when the system tried to forget," and cardboard sighed. Emma said, "Give me her name," and the air tightened. Daniel said, "Chain preserved," and he photographed each page. Nathan said, "This will crush us," and the floor held. Laura said, "It may heal her," and faith stitched itself. Maya said, "Lena Hart," and the sound fit the room. The narrator said, "Names are doors that open both ways." Emma said, "Same birth hour, same wing," and her throat burned. Daniel said, "Contact log redacted," and ink bled across the lines. Nathan said, "Julian hid her," and his jaw locked. Laura said, "We call her now," and the box waited. A knock cracked the moment as the narrator said, "Power wears cologne and deadlines." Oliver said, "By order of the court, cease handling restricted materials," and his smile was lacquer. Emma said, "You do not own my life," and heat rose. Daniel said, "Cite the statute," and he stepped between bodies and box. Nathan said, "Stand down," but anger found him late. Laura said, "Let us finish," and her plea shook. Maya said, "My license is on the line," and resolve sharpened. Oliver said, "Then walk away," and he reached. The narrator said, "Hands decide what truth remembers." Emma said, "Touch it, and I will shout this building awake," and the hallway listened. Daniel said, "Security is recording," and Oliver's grin thinned. Maya said, "I will testify," and the balance shifted. The narrator said, "Secrets prefer parking garages where echoes keep confidences." A woman said, "I logged Wing B nights," and Nurse Patel stepped from shadow with a badge and a breath. Emma said, "Did you see the swap?" and fear brightened. Daniel said, "We need a contact," and his notebook opened. Nurse Patel said, "A courier named Finch moved the file to a private archive," and the name fluttered. Nathan said, "Where?" and urgency bit the word. Laura said, "Please," and her voice gentled the dark. Nurse Patel said, "Storage locker C-17. Code is the wing number backwards," and her eyes flicked to cameras. The narrator said, "Courage wears plain scrubs." Emma said, "You may have saved us," and gratitude steadied her. Daniel said, "We go now," and the elevator chimed. The narrator said, "Lockers open like small histories." Emma said 17, and her fingers found the code in one clean breath. Daniel said, "Camera on," and a red dot bloomed. Nathan said, "If this proves it, we call Lena tonight," and Hope walked back in. Laura said, "Please be gentle," and the door rolled. Inside, a binder waited with 2 bracelets and a photo. The narrator said, "Evidence breathes without lungs." Emma said, "Her face looks like mine," and time lurched. Daniel said, dates match, and the ledger agreed. Nathan said, Julian orchestrated the whole corridor, and rage thawed. Laura said, we tell her now. And the decision stood. The narrator said, twist is no longer rumor, it is blood with a surname. The narrator said, night split under lightning as Emma faced the family table like a witness stand. Emma said, we found bracelets marked with my name and Lena's, and her voice burned. Nathan said, Julian orchestrated every signature, and shame pressed him down. Laura said, I kept you alive, and her words crumbled into apology. Daniel said, evidence holds weight now, and he stacked the binder between them. The narrator said, truth pressed against the walls like thunder desperate to enter. Emma said, tomorrow I meet Lena, and her hands shook with resolve. Nathan said, she may hate us, and his eyes searched shadows. Laura said, or she may heal us, and hope flickered. Daniel said, prepare for both, and silence closed the circle. The narrator said, morning came sharp as glass, dragging everyone toward the clinic. Emma said, I will not break before her, and her jaw set. Nathan said, I pray she sees the daughter we raised, and his voice trembled. Laura said, she will see the truth first, and she clasped her cross. Daniel said, lawyers are ready for Oliver, and he checked his watch. The narrator said, every step toward reunion cracked the ground under their feet. Emma said, her face is mine, and the mirror at the elevator door echoed her. Nathan said, you are more than DNA, and hope lifted. Laura said, you are ours by choice, and silence pressed. Daniel said, let the record show what blood confirms, and the doors parted. The narrator said, Lena walked in and silence took the floor. Lena said, you look like me, and the world narrowed. Emma said, we are sisters, and her voice bent but did not break. Nathan said, we never meant for it to fracture this way, and his palms opened. Laura said, I dreamed of both of you, and the confession floated. Daniel said, record every detail, and his pen moved. The narrator said, recognition is both balm and blade. Lena said, Julian bought my life into shadows, and anger sparked. Emma said, we bring it into light, and her fingers reached. Lena said, I am not sure I want your family, and pain folded her brow. The narrator said, climax blooms when hearts tear together and apart. The narrator said, the room cracked open when Oliver stormed in with papers like knives. Oliver said, this meeting ends under injunction, and his grin dripped. Emma said, you will not silence us, and her voice cut. Lena said, you profited off me, and her anger lit. Daniel said, camera rolling, and the lens burned red. Nathan said, who funded you? And fury wrote his words. Laura said, this is cruelty, and her hands trembled. Oliver said, families pay for survival, and his suit held the lie. The narrator said, every monster smiles before it falls. Emma said, truth is louder than your threats, and she tore his injunction in half. Lena said, then we stand together, and her eyes shone fire. The narrator said, the storm of years broke in one shattering climax. Emma said, Julian's empire falls with your silence undone, and fire lit her words. Lena said, I claim my name back, and her hands gripped Emma's. Nathan said, forgive me if you can, and his voice cracked. Laura said, I love you both, and her tears fell. Daniel said, evidence delivered, case sealed, and he pressed send. Oliver said, you will regret this, and his smirk collapsed. The narrator said, climax is the moment when fear turns into fury. Emma said, we rise from what you buried, and her spine straightened. Lena said, we are sisters, no matter the blood spilled, and the room still. The narrator said, the house of lies trembled, and truth took its throne. Morning thinned the storm as the narrator said, after thunder the house remembers how to breathe. Emma said, Lena meets us at noon, and she folded the binder shut. Daniel said, I filed the injunction response, and resolve steadied his tone. Nathan said, I will not run from this, and he stood straighter than sleep allowed. Laura said, breakfast is peace I can offer, and plates clinked like truce. The narrator said, grief and grace share the same table when truth is fresh. Emma said, Maya will bring the addendum, and her eyes kept time. Daniel said, Oliver is circling but his teeth are dull now, and he checked his phone. Nathan said, Julian will answer, and the name tasted like rust. Laura said, today we give our apology shape, and her hands smooth napkins. The narrator said, resolution is a craft of small choices practiced in daylight. Emma said, we begin with what we broke, then build what we can hold. The clinic lobby hushed as the narrator said, some rooms learn to hold apologies. Lena said, say it without dressing it, and her chin lifted. Emma said, I am sorry for the years stolen from you, and her breath held steady. Nathan said, I chose fear and called it love, and the words bent him. Laura said, I hid behind protection, and tears brightened the tile. Daniel said, we cannot fix time, only what we do with the rest, and the clock agreed. Maya said, the addendum names the pressure napair, and she placed the file. The narrator said, paper speaks, but faces finish the sentence. Lena said, I will read it and I will decide my distance, and the air cleared. Emma said, whatever you choose, I will not stop loving you, and her voice did not shake. The narrator said, resolution honors the answer even when it wounds. Phone buzzed and the narrator said, predators call when light finds them. Julian said, you misunderstand my role, and charm clattered. Emma said, your money braided our lives into knots, and anger held form. Lena said, you bought silence with my childhood, and the line chilled. Daniel said, this call is recorded, and the room steadied. Nathan said, did you threaten a nurse or a child? And the question cut clean. Julian said, I protected assets, and the words soured. Laura said, children are not assets, and her voice sharpened to steel. Maya said, legal counsel is now on, and another tone joined. The narrator said, resolution sharpens accountability into a key. Emma said, you will answer to the state and to us, and she ended the call. The narrator said, sometimes closure is a door closing on an echo. Evening softened to amber as the narrator said, after battle, the body remembers how to be gentle. Emma said, will you sit with us? And a chair waited for Lena. Lena said, I will sit, but I will not rush. And her boundaries breathed. Nathan said, I will tell you the ugliest parts, and he did not flinch. Laura said, I will listen to what you lost, and she placed her hands open. Daniel said, I drafted statements for the board and the court, and order return. Maya said, I will testify, and I will face the cameras, and conviction warmed the room. The narrator said, resolution shapes future days by naming what must never repeat. Lena said, I will meet you again next week, and hope learn to walk. Emma said, I will wait as long as it takes, and the house eased. The narrator said, tonight mercy sits among them and does not hurry. Night settled clean as the narrator said, some endings refuse spectacle and choose a steady light. Emma said, tomorrow I file the statement with Lena's edits, and purpose steadied her. Daniel said, the board will suspend the accounts tied to Julian, and his email flew. Nathan said, I will meet with victims' counsel, and pen inked resolve. Laura said, I will start a support circle with Maya, and courage found a calendar. The narrator said, resolution is work done quietly after the fire trucks leave. Lena said, I need space and I grant you a beginning, and the words balanced. Emma said, I will not text every hour, and restraint honored love. Maya said, truth will stand on record, and she gathered her coat. The narrator said, what remains is not perfect, but it is honest enough to grow. Morning found the city washed clean, as the narrator said, after the storm, the street keeps secrets in its gutters. Emma said, today we sign the public statement, and she checked each line. Lena said, use my name without softening it, and her voice held. Nathan said, I will speak and I will not justify, and shame steadied into duty. Laura said, I will stand behind you both, and her hands folded calm. Daniel said, press meets us at noon, and he packed the files. Maya said, truth on record is a shield we can carry, and her eyes were clear. The narrator said, final acts do not roar, they ring. Emma said, we named Julian and Oliver, and the machinery. And her pen moved. Lena said, then we go home together. And the word together finally fit. Cameras blinked awake, as the narrator said, truth is a small voice taught to use a microphone. Emma said, the record reflects a birth corridor built on fear, and she faced the lenses. Lena said, I was a ledger entry before I was a daughter, and silence deepened. Nathan said, I failed courage, and he raised his eyes. Laura said, I hid behind love, and called it shelter, and her voice did not shake. Daniel said, evidence is available to investigators, and he stacked copies. Maya said, I will testify under oath, and the hum in the crowd softened. The narrator said, confession lands like rain across many roofs. A reporter said, what now? And the question hung. Emma said, we live, and the word settled like a key in a door. Afternoon thinned to quiet as the narrator said, after noise the heart counts its beats again. Emma said, I kept your first photo, and she placed the Polaroid on the table. Lena said, I kept the ache, and she touched the white border. Nathan said, I will repay what cannot be repaid by showing up, and the promise felt honest. Laura said, I will not speak over your anger, and she left room for it. Daniel said, I drafted a fund for records reform, and purpose restored his calm. Maya said, I will chair it, and a new door opened. The narrator said, closure is not a lock, it is a hinge. Lena said, I am not ready to forgive, and her eyes stayed bright. Emma said, I will not rush you, and the Polaroid bridged years. Evening gathered like a soft curtain as the narrator said, families relearn grammar when the sentence changes. Emma said, we will celebrate small days, and she set 2 mugs down. Lena said, start with Saturday mornings, and a half smile found her. Nathan said, I will cook, and relief made him lighter. Laura said, I will plant lilies for what we lost and what we found, and hope rooted. Daniel said, the board froze Julian's accounts, and the news steadied the floor. Maya said, a nurse named Patel has protection now, and gratitude warmed the room. The narrator said, resolution does not erase pain, it teaches it to stand without ruling. Emma said, stay tonight if you want, and the house listened for an answer. Lena said, I will stay, and the word stayed too. Night thinned to hush as the narrator said, final moments live in the space a breath leaves behind. Emma said, there is one page I have not read, and she unfolded a letter from the binder. Lena said, if it hurts we stop, and her hand waited near. Nathan said, I can face it, and his eyes did not move. Laura said, whatever it is we remain here, and the promise held. Daniel said, documenting, and the pen hovered. Maya said, read, and the room steadied. The narrator said, truth sometimes arrives as a single line, sharp enough to cut the dark. Emma said, it says the donor signed as M. Hart, and silence rang. Lena said, mother, and breath left her. The narrator said, the last 10 seconds belong to a name that changes the shape of love.